And today on our virtual visit, we're going to concentrate on Ferrara, but we're going to talk about an artist called Giorgio De Chirico. His mother was from Genova, his father was from Messina, and he was born in Volos in Greece. His dad was an engineer, and he was working on the railroads, helping to build railroads in this area called Thessalia. So that's why Giorgio de Kirico and his brother were born in Greece. He also spent time in Paris and Munich, so that's why I've highlighted those on the map. But we're going to kind of focus in on the time that he spent in the town of Ferrara. So here's some pictures of him as a small child. So he was born in Greece in 1888. Again, his parents were Italian, but they sort of got into being in Greece. They dressed him up in that cute little costume. He and his brother Andrea, this is Giorgio De Kirico, this is brother Andrea, who actually went by the name Alberto Savinio in arte. His name in art was Alberto Savinio. They had a very interesting upbringing. They were intellectuals. Their parents really kind of helped encourage their artistic bents. So they had a very good education. They were also schooled in languages. So they obviously spoke Greece. They grew up in Greece. They also spoke Italian, French, and German. The brother, the littler boy in that family picture, was a musician and trained as a composer and was in conservatories. And Giorgio, from a very young age, was really into art and drawing and fell in love with painting and had a tutor, serious art tutor from the age of 11. He then attended the art academy in Athens. So again, he was born in 1888. He attended the Academy delle Belle Arti in Athens. And he was in school there when his dad unfortunately died in 1905. So at that point, he was about 17. So at that point, the family they sort of thought about, returning back to Italy. They kind of passed through Italy. They ended up going to Munich because his brother got accepted to a really good conservatory. Munich at that point was really kind of like what we think of Paris today. So it was this very important European cultural center. So the family literally started this sort of nomadic lifestyle going from European capitals. Giorgio, of course, was back in the art academy in Munich in that period and finished there. They ended up, they were in Paris. They kind of went through Florence. Giorgio ended up moving back to Italy and kind of divided his time between Rome and Venice and Milan. And so he really one of the things that influenced his art was this almost kind of nomadic lifestyle. And some of it was due to just sort of, outside events. His dad died and the mother, felt more comfortable taking the kids to, school back in Italy where she was from. So, or World War I, for example, they ended up in Ferrara, in fact, because of World War I. So in Munich, in any event, Giorgio is taking his university at the Academy of Fine Arts, and he starts painting. And he's really, really influenced by classic art, stuff he saw in Greece, but also kind of old master paintings. You can kind of get a feel for that here just a little bit. He was also heavily influenced by, and he's like sort of a 20-year-old at this point, right? He's really influenced by the symbolist painters. This is an example, two works of art by the painter called Arnold Brooklyn. He was born in 1802, died in 1901. He heavily influenced Giorgio de Chirico. And you can kind of see you'll notice some sort of themes from here that pop up in the works of De Chirico later. Things like the combination of mythology, the Greek ruins, these kind of almost sort of romantic, almost sort of mysterious also compositions. Notice the brooding figure over here, just kind of combining modern day things together with antique motifs. So as a very young guy, these eccentric paintings of Brooklyn, where they really did, he tended to combine myth and modernity. These really affected the young Giorgio de Chirico, who at sort of age 20 paints this painting. He's still in Munich at this point. This is called The Departure of the Argonauts. So the Argonauts are Jason and the Argonauts, if y'all remember your mythology, and they actually set sail from that bay of Thessalia, where Giorgio De Kirico was born. So he's sort of, in a sense, revisiting his own departure from his homeland in a certain way. And you can see that he's, these two figures are kind of even dressed in sort of, kind of Eastern almost dress. There's the boat with the sails, the full sails on the water. These, the little, kind of homey house up here. And then I love the statue of Athena, and look what's at the base of the statue of Athena. Two basically looks like goats who've been sacrificed as kind of a, portent for a good voyage. So this is quite kind of in that style of kind of almost romanticism and realism. And very quickly, still 1909, here is one of these paintings that kind of sort of shows you where the direction in which De Chirico is going to go. So here he is. He's, again, influenced by his background in Greece. This is called the Enigma of the Oracle. So just think about the Oracle of Delphi, this kind of mysterious oracle. Here you can see kind of an allusion to that behind the drawn curtain, right? We're not really sure what's going on back there, but there's this little head poking up. He's been influenced by Brooklyn. Notice that figure, the kind of brooding figure over here, the kind of thinking figure that's on this edge of this precipice with the modern world down below. And he's also really reading a lot. And he's really, like I said, they're kind of an intellectual family. So he is extremely absorbed by the works of certain philosophers, Nietzsche among them. So Nietzsche talks about kind of enigma and dream as an instrument for providing a revelation into kind of another reality, or kind of a hidden reality. So that idea of the enigma as the key for finding a new way of looking at things. So a year later, they decided to leave Munich. They're going to go to Paris. The family together is going to go to Paris, but they decided to stop through Florence. And they lived in the area near Santa Croce. So you can see there on the left, Santa Croce, present day, and on the right, what Santa Croce and the piazza looked like in 1910. De Chirico suffered some sort of gastrointestinal illness that was chronic. So he was often ill, he was often in the hospital. He found himself in a fall day here sitting on a bench in Piazza Santa Croce, and he was recovering from one of these bouts of illness. And he writes, I'm going to read to you what he wrote in his memoir, so I have to move this out of the way a little bit. He says he was coming out of a long period of illness. I was in a state of almost murky sensibility. Everything, including the stones of the buildings and the fountains, seemed to be convalescing. I've been in this piazza many, many times, but it's as if everything was new. In the center was the statue of Dante with his long robe. He's looking down, kind of brooding. The white marble of the statue itself had been given a pleasing gray tint. The autumn sun was warm and without love, and it lit the statue and the facade of the temple. He actually uses the word temple and not church. He says, I had this strange impression that I was seeing these things for the first time. So to him, this was almost like a mystical vision. He really felt like he was seeing these things that he'd kind of been seeing every single day for months. He felt like he was seeing them for the very first time. And then he says that he began trying to paint subjects that expressed this strong and mysterious feeling that he had discovered in the works of Nietzsche, the melancholy of the beautiful autumn afternoons, and this idea of kind of seeing reality in a different way. So that experience that he had in Piazza Santa Croce led him to paint this painting. This is 1910, The Enigma of an Autumn Afternoon. So again, it's familiar things really seen in an unfamiliar way. So here the church is sort of turned into a temple, and again those curtains are drawn, so what's back there is, it's wide open, right? There's that wall of the church behind which now is their boat with the full sails. So this idea of either coming or going, and where are you going? There's the statue is no longer Dante. It's actually sort of turned into that same kind of thinking figure that we had seen in the Enigma of the Oracle and in Brooklyn. So here we are. He's kind of created this kind of, again, familiar things in an unfamiliar way. He's kind of suspended time in a certain sense. And he refers to this, in this period, he calls these paintings enigmas, because it's a mystery. And he even says that moment was an enigma for him because it cannot be explained. And so again, this is called the Enigma of an autumn afternoon, un pomeriggio di autunno. So he's the family very soon after this moves to Paris, and he kind of continues this idea, and he very quickly drops the word enigma and starts to use the word metaphysical. So again, just another way of looking at familiar things, or looking at familiar things with kind of new eyes in a certain way, but not just new eyes. This is a painting he did in 1914 in Paris. I believe this is the first painting he ever sold, with the big red tower and the halfway hidden equestrian monument over here. So again, he's reading Schopenhauer, who had a big effect on him as well. Schopenhauer elaborated on a Kant theory that the empirical world is really just a complex of appearances that are knitted together by your consciousness. And so if we can break that kind of that chain of consciousness, then kind of reset is the word that De Chirico wrote. We can reset our memory in order to see reality in a different way. So the idea is to just kind of, get yourself out of your thoughts and kind of get yourself out of your habitual memories in order to kind of start fresh and really have new understanding, again, of looking at familiar objects. So here we have basically almost a countryside scene with these arcades that lead you right back to the big red tower. And you can see sort of half of this equestrian monument. And again, it's just sort of time suspended, vaguely uneasy almost. You're not quite sure what's going on here because these things just don't really go together in this space. Architecture is really a protagonist. Again, he's combining kind of everything that he's really kind of, the accumulation of all of his experiences, his reading of philosophy, his understanding of painting, his studying the classics, all of that have kind of come together. So he really likes the arcades, and also the shadows under the arcades, which again is that mystery. We don't really know what's going on down there. Again, the kind of combination of things that don't necessarily go together. That train is always, or quite often the train is there. So the train, again, is going to, parts unknown, as is the boat, but the train also perhaps talks about his background, his father, who sadly died when he was so young, but he was an engineer building trains through Greece. And those, again, the long shadows, things tend to not always add up to. We have very different viewpoints here. And again, that almost provides a little bit of that instability. Like, it's not totally obvious, but you're a little bit kind of not on your right footing in a certain way. I mean, we're definitely looking down on the monument here with the sleeping Greek figure. We're looking kind of directly into almost a little bit up to these arches, and we're looking right up at that huge tower in the distance. So again, we're kind of painting memory, or kind of, he's sort of creating memory in a certain sense, and he's really creating these metaphysical experiences. These almost sort of, you might use the word surreal, but he never used that word because the art movement, surrealism, he was not connected with that. He actually helped. He and his brother were involved in the Dada movement early on. Whenever they moved to these new European centers, they immediately gravitated towards the avant-garde art movement that was happening there. And so when he was in Paris, he was hanging out with various painters and also writers, among them Apollinaire, who was a very good friend of theirs. And they kind of worked on the Dada movement, which later turned into surrealism. And De Kirico was very much kind of despairing of lots of these various art movements, and he didn't really care for that. So he did not use the word surreal, he used the word metaphysical. Here's another one of these metaphysical piazzas. He did a series of piazze d'Italia, piazze of Italy, and they all have this sort of, kind of similar kind of feeling of isolation, this kind of transcending what we think of as reality. And he's kind of searching for an ideal. And I can't help but think of, and I know that Giorgio De Chirico was aware of these things. I don't know that he was making the same connection here, but one would think that he was very much aware of the tradition of ideal cities in 15th century Italy. This is an unknown 15th century artist from central Italy, painting an ideal city. And so what he's done is, in this period, they were very much working out, Italian artists, 15th century, working out how to properly render space so that it feels right. And in this case, they're trying to properly render their ideal urban plan. And they also populated these scenes. Here's the Sistine Chapel. This is Perugino in the Sistine Chapel, 1482. Peter gives this, receives the keys from Christ in kind of this view of this ideal city. So back to De Chirico, 1913. Here we are, this empty space, really kind of, dream-like. Onirico is the Italian word for that. Really kind of dream-like. You're just no longer, in this world. I mean, he's used kind of his familiar by now elements that are familiar to us in his works, including kind of the bizarre perspective, those really marked shadows of late afternoon, as he puts it, without love. So you really kind of have that feeling of isolation. So in Paris, he also started doing compositions like this. These were two different portraits of Apollinaire, his friend, the poet, who was kind of the glue of this avant-garde Dadaist group. He's shown as the kind of blind seer, the soothsayer seer from the ancient Greek period. And interestingly, there's this shadow back here, which to me looks a little bit like Dante. I'm not sure if that's the case or not, but it looks a little bit like Dante. And then he's got sort of these items of everyday life, like the mold to make a cake that looks like a fish. Like, where did this come from? So he's putting very familiar objects kind of together in an odd way. And he's done this as a kind of a way to sort of almost eulogize his friend Apollinaire, who unfortunately dies shortly after this. So Apollinaire joins the French forces in World War I. So 1915, Apollinaire goes to war. They maintain a correspondence. Apollinaire is injured and then unfortunately dies in the flu pandemic, the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918. So here's another Enigma. This is one of the last paintings I think that was painted in Paris. So here's another one, the Enigma of the departure. So they leave Paris. Here you can see, again, this sort of, melancholy piazza, incongruous shadows. Where's this coming from? This one, we know where it's coming from. This one, not so sure. And then there's that boat in the back going somewhere. So they, left again, and they ended up, the two brothers kind of following in Apollinaire's footsteps. Apollinaire was also born abroad and decided, okay, I'm going to declare myself French and I'm going to fight for the French. The De Chirico family had kind of just decided, okay, we're Italian, and they had actually enrolled in the army in Italy, and they ended up, they went back, presented themselves to the draft board, and they were sent to Ferrara. Giorgio's illnesses kept him out of combat, so he had an office job here. The brother was here as well, and ended up being sent to Macedonia as a translator. But they spent a lot of the war time here, 1915 to 1918, in Ferrara. So this is, when you go to Ferrara today, this is the great Castello Estense, the castle of the great Este family, the signori and later dukes of Ferrara. The castle was built in the late 1300s, literally as a defensive structure. It became the royal residence, the ducal residence, and is now full of their very rich art collections. They patronized heavily the great old master painters of Italy. This is one of their residences. So in the 1500s, the Este family moved out of this residence and into the castle. But when you're in Ferrara today, it really, this kind of feeling of the 1500s, you're just kind of surrounded by that. This is on the main square, right in front of the cathedral. The cathedral is even earlier. It's one of those great medieval cathedrals done by Niccolò. Any of y'all who were here for our talk on Verona, you might remember the great medieval sculptor called Niccolò. He designed this cathedral with the protiro, and remember how he does all of his illustrated lunettes. And there's St. George killing the dragon over there on the right, in the lunette of the Cathedral of St. George, right here on the main square in Ferrara. So today it looks like this. This is the side of the cathedral. Here's that residence. It's in the Po Delta, so it's very flat, so you can kind of get around by bike. So the De Chirico brothers landed here from Paris. They kind of missed this atmosphere, which of course had been kind of squashed by the outbreak of World War I, and kind of all of their friends got spread out. So they kind of land in Ferrara where they've never been before. And they kind of talk about how they kind of get used to, Ferrara by just kind of walking around and getting to know the streets and getting to know the ferrarese. And actually various artists from all over Italy ended up here. This is kind of a point, that people came to the outpost in Ferrara before they got sent off to the front or to other official points for the war. So De Chirico writes, Giorgio says, the city revealed itself to me as the most profound city, the most strange and solitary city on the planet. So he really felt this solitude here. And as far as his tastes go, the climate of the city sort of, went along with his sort of feelings of melancholy. They spent time walking through the Jewish ghetto. These are scenes from the Jewish ghetto. When the Este family was in control, it was pretty much of a free port type situation. People could practice their own religions freely. The town ended up under the control of the Papal States in the 1600s, and that's when the ghetto was established, and the Jewish population was made to live in the ghetto. So when they were there were still sort of a lot of that there was, the Jewish bakeries were all at work in the Jewish ghetto. So they walked through, and they really were marked on, and they've left writings about, the great the architecture, the shop windows. They literally talk about the metaphysical shape of the cookies in the display windows of the pastry shops in the Jewish ghetto. And interestingly, they talk a lot about the shapes, but they don't talk a lot about what they taste like, which I think is kind of funny. So they talk a lot about these metaphysical shapes of the cookies. The other brother actually went on to say, he who bites into one of the fatal cookies tastes eternity. They were kind of obsessed with these cookies in the Jewish ghetto. He also said, and I was trying to figure out, I'm going to show you in a minute why we're making ferrarese cookies. We're also going to make some bread, but I was trying to kind of figure out which recipes to make. And so De Chirico literally says, I'm walking through the Jewish ghetto, and he was just taken with the shapes, the metaphysical shapes of the cookies that he saw on display. And the brother wrote, there were these immense pyramids of bizarre sweets in the windows of the pastry shop that no living being has ever eaten nor ever will, which I think is just hilarious. I don't know who he thought was, why they were bothering to make these sweets. I think he was referring to one of these kind of a spice bread. It's called pan pepato. It's this really just dark brown lump of a thing that they must have just piled up, and he thought that didn't look very appetizing. Oopsie, excuse me. So Giorgio got over that though, and I don't know if he thought they were appetizing or not, but he thought the shapes were very interesting, and I'll show you what he did with it. So here we are, just kind of again walking through the city on the late afternoon. So you can kind of see, here we are in these almost deserted streets with the late afternoon shadows, and there's kind of that haze of the humidity in the Po Valley that really kind of played into the idea of metaphysical paintings of Giorgio De Kirico. And the top right there actually included a Brooklyn painting, because he wrote in his memoirs, he's talking all these years later, it's sort of 15 years later, and he's in Ferrara, and he talks about nightfall in Ferrara. And he goes on to say that, as we get to that solemn hour, where, let me see, I'm going to read it to you. I have to move this out of the way. That solemn hour where night, capital N, the allegory of night, sitting on an invisible chair, would have emptied with a gesture full of tenderness and grace the contents of her horn, like a sleeping potion over the city. So these romantic, kind of dreamlike paintings had a big enough effect on De Chirico that 15 years later, as the sun sets in Ferrara, he's thinking about Brooklyn's allegory of night. At this time, though, De Chirico has certainly left that behind as far as a painting style, and he's now really developed his own style. And he starts to do these, he calls them metaphysical interiors. So we're no longer in these wide open piazza with the long view with the sail in the background. We're in these very close, claustrophobic, cramped spaces. And here you have a form of bread. That's bread. That's the pane ferrarese. And it's being shown with, this is called Linguaggio del Bambino, the language of a child. It's being shown with some sweets, like a candy cane type thing, these things. And then there's almost like, I can't tell what this is. It's sort of a line drawing painting. Painting within a painting also becomes a theme of this period. And he starts to paint stuff like this. This is called A Gentle Afternoon, 1916. One of his interni metafisici, metaphysical interiors. Again, this kind of cramped claustrophobic space, kind of, just irrational space itself. We're not sure really what's going on there, and all these bizarre objects together. Sometimes there's T-squares, frames, here's an empty frame. And then the painting within a painting in vivid colors. And look at how just, the minutiae of the detail and the biscotti ferrarese. These are the ferrarese cookies. And of course, another candy cane. So there's still this idea of kind of isolation, melancholy, this remembrance, but kind of remembering through the filter and then trying to shake yourself out of that. This one's called Saluto al amico lontano. Saying good, either saying hello or goodbye, or greeting a very far away friend. So he gave these very kind of interesting value to symbols that were linked to emotional memory. So here we have the pane ferrarese, a biscotto, a cookie, and in the middle there's this drawing of an eye, and he actually writes about eyes. We have writings of De Chirico where he remembers that the ancient Cretans, so remember he was from Greece, on Crete, the ancient Cretans would use the symbol of an eye, and you still see that today. It's almost used as a kind of a good luck charm, right? On boats, you see that throughout the Mediterranean. In Turkey, they have those little good luck charms, the eye of Allah. And De Chirico kind of linked that eye up with the demon of Heraclitus, one of these ancient authors, who said the world is full of demons and the shadows. We must discover the demon in everything. And De Chirico says we must discover the eye of everything. So that's kind of his goal in painting, is to discover the eye of everything. So here's this ancient Cretan eye in this cramped, tight space with these, ferrarese baked goods stuck onto a canvas. Really interesting way of seeing the world. Here's the Rivolto del Saggio, 1916. Another one of these interiors, metaphysical interior. Again, painting within a painting, the sugar sweets, baked goods. So interesting that this is the direction that De Chirico has taken. Remember, he's very classically trained. He is a full believer in the Academy's, maybe not the system, because he's not necessarily in agreement with the output of paintings that you're supposed to make, but he definitely has this intellectual approach to painting, this academic approach to painting. And he really believes in, down to the minute details of mixing your own paints. His memoir actually contains the recipes. I know artists who use the recipes for mixing your own paints. He was totally against the tubetti, the little tubes, which, if you think about it, late 1800s, early 1900s, the artist was like squishing paint out of a tube. No. He's like searching out the little colored powders and like mixing them into, special mixes. If he was using tempera grassa, which is an egg mixture with some oil in it, though, a certain kind of oil cooked in a certain way, prepared in a certain way. He's very rigid about that. So much so that his contemporaries, some of them called him, referred to him as too conservative. And he actually broke with the surrealists over a similar type of discussion. He was considered too conservative. And I mean, looking at those paintings, it doesn't necessarily look so conservative, but his approach was such that that's kind of the reaction he got. If you look at it, though, really carefully, the space here is actually broken up in a way kind of similar to what the Cubists were doing. Remember, he was in France in the early 1900s, 1910. He knew all those guys. He was in the avant-garde group. He was hanging out with Picasso, literally, and they knew very well what each other were doing. De Chirico tended not to talk real highly about other artists, or not very many of them in any event, but he and Picasso definitely had respect for each other. So I put these two up here just so you could see that there's a kind of typical Picasso Cubist painting on the right, bowl of fruit with a violin, and he has really broken up into facets the surface of the painting. De Chirico didn't do that, but the space is actually kind of broken up. So interestingly, they're kind of doing they're doing vaguely similar things here. And interestingly, Picasso was considered by the other artists at the time and by the public as this great innovator. And De Chirico was considered kind of too conservative. And when he was attacked by that, Picasso, who collected De Chirico, by the way, Picasso was a De Chirico collector. He took up for him. He said, y'all might say, that he's too sort of linked to the past, and he has every right to do that. He has every right. So Picasso kind of tried to set it straight for all of their contemporaries. I'm going to end basically with this metaphysical work called the Distraught Muses. De Chirico is an extremely eclectic painter. He painted all sorts of stuff. He painted until 1978 when he died. So he did all kinds of things. I mean, just all over the board. So this is still, you're looking on the left at a painting from Ferrara, and then on the right, a reworking of that sort of 30 years later. So on the left, 1918, the original Distraught Muses. The Muses are daughters of Zeus. They're the people who inspire artists. They're also the goddesses of memory. I was just reminded of that. I think that's very cool. And he went through a whole period, and I'm only showing you this one of the mannequins. He actually painted mannequins quite a lot. And I mean the mannequins that are used by seamstresses. You know, they're kind of cloth stuffed with, I don't know what, to kind of make the form of the body. So that's what these heads are. They often have this kind of a figure, so you can kind of move it around, this little wooden pommel. This maybe isn't the best example of that because he stuck the seamstress mannequin head onto the marble body. It's almost like a column, but it's, you know, clearly it's kind of a ruined Greek sculpture. So here we have the Muses, and the Muses are distraught. One is looking down at the ground the way Dante was in Piazza Santa Croce. One of them has taken her head off. She's sitting down. You know, she would have her head in her lap, but basically she just took it off and put it down next to her. So the idea of these muses being mannequins, they literally have no voice. They're blind, they're mute. They just feel. So kind of this idea of this kind of human-like figure that only has feelings. And these guys aren't feeling very happy, apparently. We see in the back also kind of that mixture of modern and ancient. Here we have the train. Over here, the train is replaced with the Castello Estense, the Este castle. And he added this Greek sculpture, but the sculpture is in shadow. So I'm not totally sure what's going on here, but given his kind of sorrow over the state of modern art, he used to call in his writings, when he refers to other modern geniuses, he puts them in quotes because he really doesn't think that highly of a lot of his contemporary modern artists, painters. But I'm kind of wondering if perhaps, you know, this is sort of the Muses are distraught at the state of modern art because no one's paying much attention to classical art here and what's included, in fact, in the collection of the Este castle in Ferrara. That may not be the case, but it could be. So he obviously is quite an eclectic painter. He's a very intellectual approach to painting, very classic approach to his the technique of painting. He also will remind you that the word technique comes from the word techna, which is Greek for art. So dividing technique from art is obviously in his mind kind of ridiculous. So, and unfortunately at the end of the war, so this painting on the left was done in 1918. They had wanted to return to Paris, but things had kind of fallen apart. Apollinaire, as I said, died in a flu epidemic. Giorgio himself was actually, he caught the flu and was in the hospital, but he came out of it. The whole metaphysical movement was started by Giorgio De Chirico and other artists who were there in Ferrara with him. After the war, he ended up literally, he stayed in Italy, but was kind of nomadic, as I said, between Rome and Florence and Milan. And he really did all kinds of things. And I'm just going to show y'all, there's so much, I can't show you everything. I just want to show you some of his self-portraits. He did this enormous series of self-portraits. I mean, he did at least 100 of these things. And he's obviously got a little bit of irony as well, right? So he's this intellectual guy, but apparently has a little bit of irony because here he's showing himself in 17th century dress. This obviously is as well kind of a comment on the state of art history, maybe his place in art history as well. He's shown himself sort of in one of these romantic paintings, you know, with the Greek ruins, and he's, you know, holding his glove, which is just kind of hilarious. These, that one on the right reminds me of a Raphael painting of the Madonna where the curtains open. But if you think back to his paintings as well, you know, a lot of times there's that closed curtain. The open curtain's like, okay, here I am, y'all can see me. And on the left, you can see pretty much everything because he decided to, it's one of his later, maybe one of his last self-portraits, as a matter of fact, you know, literally stripped bare. So he kind of had this continual dialogue with classical art mixed with memory and his own experiences and all of his, you know, reading the philosophers and all that. So it's very rich output of art. We have concentrated on the section of Ferrara, and because they were so enamored with the baked goods, we're going to make a couple of baked goods. So the ones you see here in the Saluto al un amico lontano, we're going to make the biscotti ferrarese and the coppia ferrarese, which means the couple, because there's the two pieces of dough are coupled. It's also called chupetta. And this is an extremely interesting bread, which I have been just kind of enamored with myself because of the shape, but also because it has this amazing, amazing crumb. And you find it all over Emilia-Romagna, where Ferrara is located, and it's called pane ferrarese. And that's one of those things when I go to Bologna for some reason, I often have reason to go to Bologna. I very rarely find myself in Ferrara, but I always bring some of that bread home. Like, I look forward to that because one of the things I bring home from Ferrara is this bread. So I'm actually really excited to have figured out how to make it. And then on the left, the cookies, there actually are some biscotti ferrarese, and I made them and didn't taste very good. And they also didn't hold their shape in the oven. So I was sort of disappointed about that. And it occurred to me that there's this cookie called krumiri, which is the word you see here with the K, which I actually ate in Venice ages ago and always loved. And I've always remembered them. They're made with cornmeal. And so we're going to make those because they actually most closely resemble the biscotti ferrarese, which, as we know, the De Kiricos weren't eating anyway. They didn't think that they were fit for that. So I'm going to make the cookies, and we're going to make that really cool bread. So let me show y'all kind of how these recipes do. The cookies are made, as I said, with a mix of it's cornmeal and regular flour. And I first discovered them in Venice, but it turns out it's a Piemontese recipe, so from Piemonte. And they're quite popular now. I mean, you can actually buy them, you know, in the United States, you buy Oreos, and here in Italy, you buy Kurumiri. And they're quite good. And they're sweet, but they're not overly sweet. So the recipe is cornmeal, regular flour, and I'm using some of the #2 whole grain flour from my bakers. I don't think I mentioned at the beginning, we're going to take questions at the end as we usually do. And while I'm cooking, if y'all want to type in questions, Elizabeth will read them out, or we can wait to the end. So as y'all normally do with Lorenzo, you can type questions in, and then at the very end, I will answer everything. But feel free to type something in now if you would like to.
There were some
The
questions.
Sugar, oh, good.
Sorry. There were some questions from the De Chirico discussions. If I don't know if you want to hear those now or in a little bit, you tell me.
Why don't I, let me just finish describing the ingredients and then we'll go to that, okay? So I just put in some sugar, which I usually, when I finish a vanilla bean, I just stick the pods down in the sugar, a little bit of salt. We have 3 egg yolks and then some butter. And all I'm going to do is mix this up, and then I'm going to put it into a pastry sack, and I'm going to kind of pipe them out onto cookie tin. So while I'm doing that, why don't we take questions? So Elizabeth, if you want to ask the De Chirico questions.
Yes. Okay. So Kathy K asks, this is when you were talking about his initial painting style. So De Chirico is challenging us to leave the classical constructs behind. Is he sort of challenging the classical world, or is he making a commentary on the classical world?
I think he's making a commentary on the modern world. And I think his idea is perhaps that we ought not forget the classical world, and that maybe it has a place in our world, and it definitely had a place in his world. I think that's what he was getting at. I think he also had kind of great respect for history, and didn't do anything. He didn't do anything lightly, and I think he kept in mind, you know, they say history repeats itself, right? And everybody's always saying, oh, if we had only paid attention and thought about that. He's constantly remembering everything, including history, including his own experiences, and he's linking everything together with his readings with these, you know, the amazing, you know, philosophical minds. So I think that's kind of how he's pulling in the classicism, or those classicizing elements.
Kathy mentions again, she says it's interesting that there's no train or boat in the later canvases that he does.
That is very interesting. Yeah, exactly. Maybe because he had decided to stay in Italy and so was no longer, you know, maybe he felt relatively settled. That is interesting. Or maybe he had just worked it out. Maybe he felt comfortable with the fact that he had kind of given them their due. I don't know. Not sure about
No,
that.
he's a
but yes,
complicated,
interesting.
he's a complicated artist. That's
He is very
that's for
complicated,
sure.
and yes, and he would sort of say, you know, nobody understands my painting, but he didn't want to tell you, he didn't exactly explain them to you either. So a lot of that's kind of up for interpretation.
Now here's a culinary question. The cornmeal, what kind of, is it a certain texture, a certain grind number?
Well, I'm using, thank you for asking that question. I'm using
Oh, it's from
cornmeal.
Debbie A. Debbie A.
Oh, good.
asks.
Okay. All right. So I am using basically polenta, because that's the cornmeal I get here is polenta, and it's kind of chunky. And when I get these cookies from a pastry shop, or if you buy them at the grocery store, they've used a finer grind of cornmeal, which is probably what you get if you were to make, you know, cornbread. So it's this is sort of a whole grain, very chunky cornmeal that comes from a stone grinder mill over in the Casentino that my miller friends bring in. Y'all can use, you know, like I said, I think it would be more proper probably to use a finer grind, but it doesn't really matter. And I was even thinking, these are so good. It's a really interesting concept, but I was even thinking for all of y'all, we have a lot of people from the South here. I was thinking that it might be kind of interesting even to try it with grits. I don't know if anyone's ever made a dessert with grits before. I've never heard of one, but it's an idea. So this dough could go into one of those kind of pastry sort of syringe things, but I don't have my unit doesn't have the proper die mold or stamp, whatever you call it. So I do it this way. This dough is just soft enough to make it through the star point of the sacapoche. So I'm going to just line them out here. So you make them about 4 inches long. And this dough is great because it is soft enough to come out of here, but it really holds its shape in the oven. And it looks just like De Chirico's metaphysical cookies. And it's quite good. Oh, I just lost it. Okay, I'm using a plastic piping bag. It would be better to have a more professional type of cloth piping bag. So anyway, they come out like this, and they go into the oven for about 10 minutes, and then they're done. So I'm going to show y'all the bread, and we're not doing a ton of cooking on the program today because some of it just kind of takes too long to whip up. The bread, though, it's called a pasta dura, and it is, which means a hard dough, and it's a super hard dough. And so you really do it in the machine. I did it in the KitchenAid, and I did it with the dough hook attachment. And I'm going to show you all the ingredients, and I'm going to show you this dough. It looks like it comes out like modeling clay. It's really interesting. And there are types of pasta dura all over Italy, and they make one in Modica. And the way they knead it, because they are kneading it by hand, they have, I couldn't find a picture of it. They have these, it's a 2-person job, and they have like a huge tree trunk on one end that somebody kind of lifts up, and then it drops down onto the dough. That's how they knead the dough. And then they lift up this tree trunk, and they turn the dough, and then they drop the tree trunk on it again. So when you're working with pasta dura, if you're going to do it, use the KitchenAid and just go with technology and use the dough hook. So what the ingredients here are white flour and starter, and I have some sourdough starter. I stopped by the bakery and talked to the baker about how to do this because I'd never made a pasta dura before, and I wanted to do it in honor of Giorgio De Chirico. So I got some input from the baker. So I got a little bit of sourdough starter, and I started my own. So here's my mother load, as they say, of sourdough starter. You use this is about how much you use for this recipe. Hang on. You use kind of almost like a walnut size. Hang on. This is how much starter is in that recipe. So I need to make a lot of chupette. And I'm calling it sourdough. It's not super sour. I don't know if sourdough is another, I'm not a huge baker, so I'm not sure about American sourdough when we call it that. but this is just a natural starter. So maybe I should just say it that way because it's not super sour. It does not have that tang to it. A tiny little bit of tang, but nothing like sort of what we think of as San Francisco sourdough. So the recipe is flour, that starter, lard, just literally, you know, Crisco. I have it in a sack even, Crisco, and then some baker's malt, which you can get at the King Arthur Flour Company sells it in their catalog. You can also, this helps with the rising, although this dough doesn't really rise very much. And what this helps is also kind of gives it a nice brown crust. And some of the recipes said you can actually also just use a little bit of honey instead. But this is what the malt looks like. And you just use kind of a tablespoon of the malt powder, or maybe kind of a scant tablespoon of honey. A lot of times, I remember Domino's Pizza actually used to use sugar, and they may still do that, in their pizza dough so that it would have a nice brown crust. So you kind of use that to give it a little bit of color. And it doesn't actually turn out to have a ton of color anyway. Then salt and olive oil, and you mix this dough up, and again, just let it knead in with the dough hook, and it turns into this just like literally almost like kind of modeling clay texture. It's a really kind of just tough dough, and it has an interesting. This has been sitting for a while. I'm going to show you the interior of it. So all of you bakers out there, you know, there's no air bubbles. You know, this is an anomaly, that one. It's just this, you can kind of see how it looks like the interior is like modeling clay. So this is also a dough that you form it, then you let it rise, and then you don't touch it. You just stick it in the oven and bake it. So I'm going to show y'all how to form these chupette with their very interesting form. And interestingly, there so you take 2 pieces of dough of equal weight, roll them out a bit. There was literally a ducal decree in the 1200s in Ferrara that kind of decreed how the bread was supposed to be. And it was supposed to be, it wasn't real detailed, but it said that it should have orletti. You know, it should be sort of have kind of decorated edges. So they've always been paying attention to their bread in the bakeries of Ferrara, which kind of cracks me up because, you know, the Sicilian bread I was just talking about, those ladies were making it at home. They had this huge, you know, the tree trunk method. They didn't have any bakeries. So there must have been bakeries in Ferrara even from the ducal period. They must have been relatively well off. So I'm just making
Did they add salt to the, so no salt?
There is salt, yes, salt.
Okay.
This has salt, and actually you can kind of see it in the dough. Okay, you see those little white pocks? That's literally the salt. I use kind of a chunkier salt. So you just kind of you can do this without rolling it out. You don't really roll it out. You just kind of flatten it a little bit. Flatten each piece of dough. And then you kind of do this interesting kind of rolling it up with your fingers, and it turns into that really metaphysical, for lack of a better word, shape. So that's all you have to do with the rolling pin. You also, the reason that you do this, the baker told me, well, so what I'm about to do, if you can see this, I'm gonna kind of stretch with this hand, and I'm gonna push and spread like this. I'm gonna go like push and then kind of spread open. So I'm pushing, and you kind of roll and unroll, and I'm really pushing and spreading. And the reason I'm doing this is to rompere la maglia. And the maglia is like a mesh. And I'm trying to break the mesh. So my baker friend described this to me as breaking the mesh. And that keeps the pasta dura hard. It keeps it from fluffing up and making a lot of air bubbles, because the point of this bread is that when it's done, this is what's so just kind of elusive about it. It's got this thin, crispy crust, and it's got this super soft, really dense interior. And part of that is because you're using some lard or Crisco. And part of that is because you've made this heavy, heavy dough that would have a hard time rising anyway. And whatever rising or fluffiness it was going to do, you're like beating the life out of it as you press down. So I'm really pressing and kind of spreading with my fingers in order to make this funny little roll. So you make a roll, and I'm going to show it to you. You leave a little tongue. So the roll looks like this. See how it comes out, and you have all of those. You kind of see this kind of scales of the chupetta, and then you leave a little tongue here. So I'm going to do one more. So these get formed, and then, like I said, they rise for 2 hours, and then baked in the oven just for sort of 20 minutes. And it's a good, really kind of resistant bread. It stays, it's got this odd sort of dry texture. It's kind of velvety dry. It's hard to describe. But again, it's so good. I literally bring home several forms of it every time I go up into Emilia Romagna. And of course, you know, you can't find it here because no Tuscan baker is going to be making pane ferrarese. All right, so here's another form.
Sometimes they make the pane pugliese.
I know, but because all they have to do is throw some salt in the dough. It doesn't take much work. That's my theory. So I now have my 2 little chupette things. I'm gonna make a copia. I'm gonna make a couple out of it. And so you just take the 2 little tongs and kind of squish them together so that they stick in the oven. You know, they kind of bake together, and you make a little X form out of it. And next thing you know, look, it looks like a De Chirico painting, doesn't it? Isn't that great? So now you just put a cloth over it, let it rest 2 hours, and then into a hot oven, a little bit hotter than 350, and 20 minutes, and you're done. I'm going to show you what they look like. So,
Has anyone been to Ferrara? Has anyone in the group been to Ferrara?
good question.
Seeing if anyone has. If you haven't, it's a wonderful town to go visit.
Don't eat the cookies. Eat these cookies. These are the krumiri. Really, really, and see how great they hold their shape? And they're just so tasty. They're they have that kind of that savory bite because of all of the cornmeal. And then here's the bread. Are you ready? Here's the bread, the done bread. Isn't that just gorgeous? And again, so good. I'm going to show you what it looks like on the inside. I'm going to break it in half, and then I'll show you.
Are they always connected, or sometimes are they separate?
Well, in Ferrara, they're connected. See what it looks like? It's just sort of, it's got just this, there's some air in there just from the layers, from the rolling, but the crumb of the bread itself is just this really again, it's just weird, kind of almost dry, velvety. It's so good. And it's really good with some of the salamis and stuff they eat up there. So in Ferrara, they make these, as far as I know. In Mantua, they use the same dough and make a little bun. And then in Bologna, you can find some other shapes. But in Ferrara, as far as I know, that's this is bread. They don't do anything else with it. They make a copia. So, any more questions?
Audrey says that her husband's been to Ferrara 5 times. So you better
That's great.
follow that recipe then and enjoy some of the Ferrara bread.
Exactly. He'll be happy to have some bread.
Elaine, this is Jean Marzalek. I somehow I could not see what you were doing when you were rolling that bread. Did you cut strips and roll each one individually?
I'll show you again. Hang on a second. I took a little chunk of dough.
Yeah, if you could stay where you are, because it was lower and I couldn't see it on my screen.
Okay, can you see it here?
Yes.
So I'm taking a chunk of dough, and then I'm flattening it a little bit. That's a little bit too. This is actually, you're just kind of helping yourself out a little bit. You don't even have to do that. You have to have really use a ton of pressure with your fingers if you don't do this first. You could just start. I mean, I've seen some bakers just start from here, and they start kind of doing the kind of push down, and you're literally pushing your fingers down and spreading them open like that. But I don't have the power in my fingers. And so I'm starting out with a little flat piece like this. It just helps me a little bit. And then you kind of roll and unroll and push and spread with your fingers. And by doing that, you're helping get the crumb, the very soft, velvety crumb. And then B, you're getting this funky shape, which I'm going to do a couple more, then I'll show you how it looks. So as you roll, it kind of starts to look like that. that's it.
Wonderful, wonderful.
Thanks. So, and y'all have anybody else have questions?
Well, there is one question from Linda. She asks, when do you think the old shows will be available?
We should have asked that question when Lorenzo was on the line earlier. He popped in to say hello because he's not working on the videos. He's on his motorcycle. I really actually thought we were going to have 3 of them online last week, and they're not. So I will pass your question along to Lorenzo, and we'll see what we can do about that. I'm trying to make them look pretty, and I may just give up on making them look pretty and just stick them up there. So one way or another, we should be getting them up there. I'm sorry for the delay. I know it's getting to be ridiculous. Somebody I see says looks like a chromosome. Jila says the bread, it does look like a chromosome. I think that's hilarious. It does. Okay. Any more comments?
Like a Pillsbury crescent roll. David said it looks
kind of
like.
sort of. But actually, I'm telling you what, it's actually not that much harder than opening up that little Pillsbury crescent package. It's really not. I mean, you have to, it's just such a tough dough. You need to let the machine do everything. So it's actually fun to make, and it's not super difficult. And the results are spectacular. It's worth it. Worth it. So, all right, y'all, thank you very, very much. Elizabeth, thank you so much for tuning in. I'll be sending recipes tomorrow. Thank you. I forgot to say in the beginning, thank you very much to everybody who's made a donation for this program. We very much appreciate it. Elizabeth and I both very much appreciate it. And if anybody would like to make a donation, I'll be sending along information with the recipes that will be coming out tomorrow. Okay. Y'all, thanks so much for being here. It's great to see everybody.
Kathy just
very
says
interesting.
One idea could be a show for doing essentials of the Italian kitchen.
Wait, say that again.
One idea of a new show could be on essentials for an Italian kitchen.
Good idea. I will keep that in mind. I will. Actually, I'm thinking already of artists who painted cupboards and things. Okay. All right. So that's a good idea. All right. I'll work on that. On the schedule. Actually, feel free to write in with requests too. That would be helpful. All right. Thank y'all. Have a good Saturday. It's very good to see everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye, Lane.
Bye. Bye.